As we lie in bed tonight, I pray that all will be alright. Soon the birds will start to sing, hope and joyfulness they bring. Love is all around us, so let's protect what He gave us. Da 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 da. I see trees of green and red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day and the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
A world full of wonder that continues to suffer as humankind continues to neglect her.
The forests of the world are the life of the world.
Home to over 80% of land animals and plants, and sustaining 1.6 billion people on which it is dependent.
The health of our forests dictate our existence, our livelihood, our daily subsistence.
And only when forests can breathe, can we breathe.
Yet we continue to deny our earth and the protection she deserves.
Unable to express her sorrow and outrage in words.
These instead manifest in mortally dangerous storms and painfully hot summers.
Even in disease outbreaks that lead to pandemics,
which have also exposed an array of socio-economic crises.
And in the Philippines, even with a log ban and a greening program in place,
losses from illegal logging eclipse our reforestation gains.
We are one of the world's centers of biodiversity, yet our NDC excluded forestry.
And in Indonesia, despite our deforestation rate hitting a historic low in 2020,
our NDC still allows vast deforestation
that could potentially clear 3.25 million hectares of rainforest by 2030.
Citing that oft-used excuse of progress through economic growth.
But progress that isn't sustainable shouldn't be called progress at all.
Progress is made when politicians acknowledge the urgency of the climate crisis.
And the state of our society and environment actually match up to their pretty words and promises.
Progress is when businesses listen to demand.
The demand of the people, who would choose sustainability if they were given the chance.
Businesses with values in their value chain.
And who don't confine this Earth's finite sources to society's upper 1%.
But instead, share it fairly with the 7.9 billion people on the planet.
Governments and businesses already work with each other.
They just need to work in the right direction with the people they're supposed to serve together.
And we, the youth,
have the energy,
creativity,
and bravery
to claim the world we want to see.
While we're young, we must learn to work together
and recognize the unique value and contribution of each other.
For in this critical decade, for the climate that we find the peak of our youth in,
Our choices, our patterns, our behavior can determine the course of the world.
So join us.
No matter where you are or what you're doing,
You have a place in the climate space.
Together, let's reimagine
a world that stayed below 1.5 degrees.
Where not only the mountains, but also the cities are filled with trees.
And we can all breathe and live freely.
this is the world we want for you and for me.
Me and me
And me.
and me.
Isabuhay natin.
Mari
kita
kita
wujudkan.
wujudkan.
Let's make it a reality.
I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
People ask me what my secret is, I just smile and say, follow me. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Life's too short not to really live, I got a big heart, I can let you in. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. On top of the world. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. On top of the world. People ask me what my secret is, I just smile and say, live for today. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the sun came up and I gotta say, see it in a whole new way. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Yeah. On top of the world. Yeah. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Yeah. On top of the world. Yeah. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. People ask me what my secret is. On top of the world. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Ask me what my secret is. On top of the world. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Yeah, I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world.
Hello world, wake me up to another good morning, time to go. Got that smile upon my face, cause there's excitement in the chase, this I know. Yeah, I'm going for the ride and find myself, I am alive, and I soar. Still I run towards the wind and let the challenge draw me in, cause I want more. Oh, we are all looking for adventure. 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 simply can't deny it, that I feel adventure calling out to me. Yeah, we are all looking for adventure. 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 We are all looking for And I'm living free, living free, living free, and I was meant to be. Living free, living free, living free, and I was meant to be. I'm living free, living free, living free, and I was meant to be free. Meant to be free.
Magandang hapon po, Pilipinas. Isang makulay na hapon sa ating lahat. I am Ferth Manaysay, the Engagement Officer of the Climate Reality Project Philippines, at ang inyong host para sa isa na namang makabuluhang episode ng Klimatotohanan. Makasama ko ngayong hapon ay ang aking kaibigan na isa ring Climate Reality Leader at kasalukuyang Program Manager ng National Resilience Council o NRC. The NRC is a private-public partnership that aims to build a resilient Philippines by building the capacities of local governments on evidence-informed risk governance and strengthening high-level collaboration between national government agencies and industry. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome po natin si Anjela. Hello, Jel. Thank you for agreeing to co-host this episode with me.
Hi, Ferth! At magandang hapon po sa aking mga kapwa climate reality leaders at mga allies in climate change movement na nanonood ng ating live webcast ngayon. I'm happy and honored to be here today to be co-hosting this special Pride Month episode entitled Invisible, Ignored, Ingenious, LGBTQIA+ Pinoys in the Face of the Climate Crisis. Ang episode na ito ay naglalayong bigyan ng malawak na espasyo para pag-usapan ng mas malalim pa ang tinatawag na intersectionality ng pagsulong ng LGBTQIA+ rights at ng climate justice. At malalaman natin ngayon ano nga ba yung mga issue at mga hamong kinakaharap ng ating mga kapatid sa LGBTQIA+ community na may kinalaman sa climate crisis. So ano nga ba yung mga paano sila nagiging mas vulnerable sa climate-related disasters? Alam ko, Ferth, malapit ang episode na to sa puso mo.
Tama ka, Jel. So bilang proud member ng LGBTQIA+ community, sobrang excited ako sa balitaktakang magaganap maya-maya. Alam mo kasi, Jel, bukod sa diskusyon kung paano ba dumadagdag ang climate crisis sa existing vulnerabilities ng sexual and gender minorities, i-highlight din natin kung paano makakatulong ang aming boses sa pagpapalawig ng climate change movement. Pero bago ang lahat, una, nais ko muna pasalamatan on behalf of the Climate Reality Project Philippines ang ating mga partner organizations for this episode. Una na dyan ang ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, ang Bisdak Pride, ang MapBeks, ang Metro Manila Pride, at ang Mindanao Pride. Pangalawa, nais ko ring paalalahanan ng ating viewers, meron ulit tayong Certificate of Participation para sa mga susubaybay sa ating episode. Ipopost lang namin sa comment section ng Facebook ang instructions para makakuha nito. So ayan, Jel, so wag na nating patagalin pa. So ipapakilala natin ang ating mga panauhing pandangal ngayong hapon.
All right, allow me to introduce our first speaker. She is a climate reality leader, a gender consultant for the Asian Development Bank, and is an accredited workplace gender equality consultant of the Philippine Business Coalition for Women Empowerment. She also co-facilitates the Gender Equality, Diversity, and Social Inclusion training of the Civil Service Commission. In addition to her work on advancing gender, she serves as a lecturer on courses such as tools on gender mainstreaming, geopolitics, ASEAN studies, international relations, and environmental diplomacy at the De La Salle College of St. Benilde in Manila. Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel Marie Ann Basas. Hi, Rach.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. Sa mga viewers natin, magandang hapon po. I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Yes, hi Rach. So could you answer this question very shortly? How would you explain SOGIE to newbies?
Oh, where to begin? Well, since I have my co-speakers here, and I think you will also ask them the same question, I'll just begin with the three elements of SOGIE. It's an acronym. So you have sexual orientation, the SO, GI, which is gender identity, and then E, which stands for expression. So sexual orientation basically means to whom are you romantically or sexually attracted to. Gender identity stands for your own sense of self. How do you identify yourself? How do you see yourself? And expression means how you package yourself or how you want to be perceived by others. So I'd like to end. I'll leave everything else to my co-speakers here, but I'll end with this. I wanted for the viewers to remember this one that SOGIE is a very inclusive. It's very inclusive because it's a very essential part of our identity, and everybody has one. So with that, I'll end this my SOGIE 101 so to speak.
Ayan. Thank you so much, Rachel. So our next guest is the regional coordinator of the ASEAN Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Gender Expression Caucus. They have been involved in LGBTQIA plus activism in the Philippines for more than a decade, where they helped organize pride marches in Metro Manila and conducted human rights education with youth activists. They have also worked with human rights organizations such as the Philippine Human Rights Information Center, Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, and Child Rights Coalition Asia. Isang karangalan po na makasama natin ngayong hapon si Ryan Silverio. Hi Ryan. So can you say hi to
hello,
our
Ferth.
viewers?
Hello, Anjela, and thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Ryan. So just like Rachel, can you answer briefly how would you explain SOGIE to newbies?
Wow, I think our first speaker gave an amazing definition of SOGIE, but I'd like to stress this point that all of us have SOGIE. It's not limited to the LGBTIQ communities or movements. Even straight people, cisgender people have SOGIE. Unfortunately, there are persons who are discriminated or marginalized on the basis of their SOGIE because of the prevailing patriarchal, heteronormative, and heterosexist and cisgender culture that we have in the Philippines and in many spaces across the world.
Okay, maraming salamat Ryan for emphasizing na lahat tayo may SOGIE. So let's get to know our next speaker. He is a climate reality leader and currently a communications officer for the Climate Action Network International, leading the social media strategy and digital campaigns for the network of over 1,500 environmental NGOs in more than 130 countries. He has also over 10 years of experience in climate change communications, environmental research, and social justice and rights campaigns in the private sector, government, and civil society, including as Southeast Asia organizer for 350.org, and currently as a communication specialist for UNOPS Cities Alliance. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Miki Eva. Hi, Miki. Could you please say hi to our viewers? And
Hi,
briefly,
Angela.
and how would you explain SOGIE to newbies?
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Ferth. So I'm a visual learner, so I'll be a bit visual about this. So for me, SOGIE is the sexual orientation, kanino ka attracted, kanino ka nagkakagusto, and G, ay kung sino ka at sino ang gusto mong maging. Kung lalaki, babae, or both, or none of the above. And also, it's a spectrum. So it doesn't limit it's not binary, it's not one or the other. And also, it's also fluid. So you can move around from that spectrum throughout your lifetime. So let's be proud of that. Happy Pride, everyone.
Wow, sobrang creative nung pagkaka-describe ni Mickey. Thank you so much, Mickey. So for the next speaker, we have the founder of MapBeks, an online community of online volunteers advocating for LGBT representation in various mapping platforms. He is currently the community manager of the Open Mapping Hub Asia Pacific, where he supports local communities in the use of open mapping and data initiatives in the region. He's also an active volunteer mapper in OpenStreetMap and has worked with various NGOs such as the United Nations Human Settlements Program, the Philippine Red Cross, the Asia Foundation, and Corday. Ladies and gentlemen, Mikko Tamura. Hello, Mikko. Thank you for being with us today. Just like the others, how would you explain SOGIE to newbies?
Grabe, parang naubos na yata yung definition. So I would totally agree with the first three contestants. Anyway, I'd like to just give emphasis na lang na ang SOGIE, walang ibang taong magde-determine yan, kundi sarili mo lamang. So dapat hindi tayo pumapayag na ayun, pumapayag na ibang tao ang nagde-determine or nagde-judge ng ating mga SOGIE. And I do agree with our first three panelists. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that very inspiring message, Mikko. And our last speaker is a community organizer and project manager for almost 2 decades, working towards strengthening the LGBTQIA+ communities in Southern Philippines, and founded Bisdak Pride Incorporated in November 2005. He is also the executive director of the newly formed heritage group in Cebu, the Andi Cebu Heritage Center. Currently, he is involved in various non-government humanitarian organizations as a member of the Board of Trustees, and is a PhD candidate in sociology, health, family, and population dynamics track at the De La Salle University, Manila. Ladies and gentlemen, our last speaker is Roxanne Doron. Hello, Roxanne.
Yes.
Okay. So, how about
good afternoon,
you?
everyone. Yeah.
Good afternoon. How about you?
Yeah.
How would
I think the message of SOGIE is that we are all the same, and at the same time we are also different. Because of that, we need to respect each other's diversity, uniqueness. So that should be the message to everyone what SOGIE is all about. Thank you.
Ayan. Thank you so much, Roxanne. And all our speakers for a very wonderful introduction round. So it's time to get the ball rolling, ika nga, no, Jel? So to start our discussion, let's call a spade a spade. So the current reality is that the sexual and gender minorities are often excluded in national policy frameworks on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction and management. So kasabay ng pakipaglaban ng LGBTQIA+ communities for equal rights in our society, climate change adaptation policies and action have also been very silent on the adversities and unique challenges confronting the members of the community. And this will be the focus of our first segment of the show. So to frame the discussion, our first question will be for our gender expert in the panel. Rachel, bakit nga ba mas vulnerable or disproportionately affected ang ating sexual and gender minorities to climate change? So how is the climate crisis compounding the struggles of the LGBTQIA+ communities? Rachel, are you there?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Ferth. Before I begin with anything, please let me state that my views here and my reflections, my opinions do not necessarily reflect those of the Asian Development Bank, its staff and its employees, and all other organizations I'm affiliated with. So opinions are purely my own. Okay, so I'd like to share my screen. I prepared something. It's just 7-slide presentation just to emphasize some points, and I'll be zeroing in on the impacts as Ferth has mentioned. What are the impacts of climate change to the LGBTQIA? But before I answer that, I think it's important to delve in the vulnerabilities of LGBTQIA first. What are the specific vulnerabilities that the LGBTQIA face that makes them experience the greatest impacts the greatest negative impacts from climate change? So I'll go now with the presentation. My first point here is that climate change affects each and every one of us, but its effect, it's not the same for all. As we know by now, my co-climate reality leaders here and those in the audience, who are aware of climate change and who are advocating that climate change is real. Um, Climate change really exacerbates the frequency, the intensity, the magnitude of natural disasters. And it's a lived experience here for us Filipinos, especially here in the Philippines. It's personal to us. We experience typhoons, for example, just typhoons in so many disasters. Typhoons, for example, we experience it every year. But in the recent years, we've noticed its strength became it's markedly now stronger than before. There are more typhoons ever than before. And those who are vulnerable and marginalized to begin with, they experience and will continue to experience the greatest negative impacts from climate change because of their lack of wherewithal or the lack of means to protect themselves, to insulate themselves, to provide a cushion to protect themselves from the effects of climate change. And also because of the lack or inadequate support of government or state interventions and other groups. And the LGBTQIA is one of such groups that experiences that inadequate support, lack of means because of certain vulnerabilities. And I'll go to the LGBTQIA now. You know that the community has long struggled for equal rights and visibility, and we see that the road is still long ahead. The fight for equal rights, for social justice, is still ongoing. The LGBTQIA remains a victim of inequitable systems that lead to exclusion and discrimination. And for example, just here in the Philippines, to date, there is still no national legislation protecting LGBTQIA or um, giving them, according them, legal rights, legal recognition, and civil rights, especially for same-sex unions. And it's a similar experience in the majority of countries around the world. In fact, globally, only 30 countries to date have, legal recognition to same-sex unions. And compounding that is, the LGBTQIA's lack of representation. They are not given a seat on the table. Um, there's already that gap that we recognize, right? That I've given a global context and we recognize that gap, but still the LGBTQIA remains at the margins of this policy-making offices, policy-making avenues. The voices are not heard. And as such, the resulting policies, the resulting legislation do not adequately respond to the need of the LGBTQIA just because they are not there to begin with. Their voices are not heard to begin with. And so that's the same in the spectrum, in the overarching laws and policies that we have here in the Philippines. Let's situate it in our country so that we can relate. And that includes, our climate legislations, our climate policies, and disaster policies. Speaking of disasters, let's now go to the vulnerabilities that I wanted to highlight that, compounds the negative impacts that the LGBTQIA experience. Prior, during, and in the aftermath of disasters, the LGBTQIA community may not have access to crucial assets, resources, and information. For example, let's go to the preparedness efforts. And this is something that's I've experienced directly. I'm interfacing with, the LGBTQIA and other stakeholders in my line of work. That in preparedness efforts, they are not included in the lists of government listing, or any directory for aid or emergency response, just because they don't fit the definition of a family, or what the Philippines defines as a family. And so during disasters, they are unable to access government provided relief or aid because they are not in that definition or category of what a family is. And this is true for the Philippines, as I mentioned, and it's also true for other countries outside the Philippines. In India, for example, those who identify as neither a man or a woman, they are, totally excluded from government interventions. They are not provided housing or even evacuation centers or emergency shelters, just because of their identification. And that's, one vulnerability and one impact that the LGBTQIA experience. Another, that's when we're now talking about emergency shelters and evacuation centers. Even those facilities, during disasters, they do not adequately respond to the needs of the LGBTQIA community, because of the lack of adequate facilities, such as, for example, toilets or showers or safe spaces. In the US, for example, during the Hurricane Katrina, perhaps our listeners, our viewers are aware of this also, of the Hurricane Katrina. It really devastated the US. And during that time, several people, trans people, are arrested or jailed because of using shower facilities and women's restrooms. So that's another aspect that's compounding the negative effects of climate change to LGBTQIA, the acceptance or openness of people, of the society, and that safe, inclusive space, that is not accorded or that is not provided. Another vulnerability, during disasters, even in the aftermath of disasters, where medical attention is crucial, especially for those who experience traumatic events. Services such as counseling, for example, or medical services are not adequate for the needs of LGBTQIA. For example, even for trans people, there's a statistic here. A study shows that 1 in 4 trans people in the last year did not, specifically go to medical attention after disasters, just because they are afraid of being mistreated or being discriminated upon. And that's another, barrier, the systemic, the inequitable system that leads to exclusion and discrimination. And even during disasters, some LGBTQIA face heightened hostility because they are blamed for the occurrence of disasters. Even under normal circumstances, the LGBTQIA remains one of the most vulnerable groups experiencing gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. But these experiences are heightened and are exacerbated during disasters because some people, some groups blame them. I've heard of this firsthand also, that they are being blamed, that they are attracting, people are telling them they are attracting the wrath of God, because of their sins, because of being LGBTQIA. And this, as I mentioned before, the society, the groups, the open-mindedness, which is still lacking, and that inclusive perspective, that really compounds, the lack of these really compounds what LGBTQIA are experiencing, in relation to disasters, in relation to climate change. And also, in the aftermath of disasters, many LGBTQIA become homeless, or they settle in places with inadequate housing provisions or with dilapidated conditions. And in these conditions where the climate hazards are becoming more severe, for example, during typhoons and when they experience floods. And the LGBTQIA becomes then vulnerable to these situations, to these extreme weather events, and to the effects of these extreme weather events. They also face difficulty in looking for employment. Under normal conditions, this is already an issue for LGBTQIA. They experience difficulties in looking for employment, especially since many of the workspaces, offices still are not safe and inclusive, as of today. Even today, there are still many offices that are not safe and inclusive. And this is exacerbated after disasters when many people are looking for employment, and the LGBTQIA are still being excluded from that sphere, especially for example for trans people mostly. A study from the University of Chicago, it's a global study, and it shows that unemployment rates for trans people are thrice than that of the general population. So imagine that number. And it's really a significant barrier, even under normal conditions, but more so during disasters and the aftermath of disasters. So, those are some of the vulnerabilities that are surfaced, in my line of work and in what I do. And I know there are many other voices that are not heard, that are not reflected here. And, just this forum for us to have this discussion, an open space, a safe space. I'm really happy to be partaking in this one because we are raising awareness, we are raising visibility. It's what's important right now, to raise visibility to those voices, and hoping that it reaches our local, our national decision makers. So yeah, I'd like to just end with this one. It's not disasters that exclude and discriminate, but it's the relief and recovery practices that do discriminate. So I hope that it will change in the short run, in the long run, with our efforts, as climate reality leaders, as advocates, and as gender advocates. I hope that we become the spark towards the change, even if it's gradual change, so long as there's something that we do in our individual level that will eventually, compound and grow. So I think I end my presentation with that, and I hope that I've answered the question that was posed by Ferth and by Jel, by Anjela. And thank you so much for this space again. And it's an honor and pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rich, for that very powerful message. You said, diba, it's not disasters that exclude and discriminate. So, tama nga, no, yung climate change, it adds another layer to the already long list of threats na kinakaharap na LGBTQIA plus community.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. So, sinusuportahan nito yung ating advocacy statement sa climate reality that climate crisis isn't simply an environmental and development issue. It's a human rights issue as well. At dahil nga human rights, nakapaloob din dito sa climate conversation, dapat yung LGBTQIA plus rights. Dahil their rights are human rights as well. At para mas palalimin pa ang ating usapin, let us call on Ryan, who leads the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus. Ryan, are you there?
Hello, I'm here.
Hi.
I have some slides to show. Here, just few.
Yes. So we have several questions for you. Is it okay if I enumerate na? We have 3.
Yes, please.
Para tuloy-tuloy na yung answer mo. So first, how is your organization advocate for LGBTQIA plus rights? Second, based on your experience working closely with the members of the community, ano nga ba yung mga specific na pagsubok na kinakaharap ng LGBTQIA plus sa isang climate vulnerable na bansang kagaya ng Pilipinas? And lastly, how can we promote LGBTQIA plus rights-based approaches to climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction?
Sure. Amazing questions. All right, so let's just wait for the slides. Okay, yep. ASEAN SOGIE Caucus is a regional LGBTIQ organization. We are based here in the Philippines. However, we work in 11 countries in Southeast Asia. We started in 2011 with a primary objective to influence ASEAN member states, and other political bodies to incorporate LGBTIQ issues into their human rights protection and promotion related mandates. So we continuously do this together with local LGBTIQ organizations in the region. We help local groups navigate through human rights mechanisms such as submitting alternative reports to UN treaty bodies, submitting and engaging in the Universal Periodic Review, and submitting communications with the UN Special Procedures mandate holders. And at the same time, we also recognize that engaging with ASEAN political bodies entail a strong anchor based on the realities and work of local LGBTIQ groups. So we provide support, including technical assistance to more than 30 LGBTIQ local organizations across the region. And recently, in the context of the COVID-19, we found ourselves expanding our work to addressing the emergency realities of LGBTIQ groups. Last April, we conducted a rapid needs assessment, and then we realized that there's so much vulnerability being experienced by LGBT groups, primarily because of number one, they don't have much access to long-term funding. Number two, so much reliance on volunteers who themselves were also economically affected by the pandemic. And then number three, they're also facing vulnerabilities because many of them exist in a context of criminalization and social stigma. So we've provided emergency support and at the same time continuously lobbied donors and other international agencies because, as you know, this is the sad reality in global LGBTIQ and human rights funding. There is this artificial binary between advocacy and humanitarian response. But given the pandemic and so many crises that our communities have faced, this binary no longer makes sense because empowering local LGBTIQ activists also requires provision of support primarily for their basic necessities. So I'd also like to emphasize that within ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, we take the principle of intersectionality seriously. In fact, we've incorporated this as one of our guiding principles, and we've operationalized this by putting as a strategic priority mainstreaming of SOGIE SC across ASEAN civil society organizations and social movements. We've done some strides in doing work in partnership with child rights organizations, with women's rights organizations. But to be honest, we haven't done much work in relation to advocacy around climate justice. And so when I got the invitation from your organization, I realized, this should be an interesting entry point for us to see the nexus between LGBTIQ and climate justice. Now, in preparation for my presentation, I've scanned around our networks and member organizations who, in particular, are working on the issue of climate justice or climate change. And sadly, I only got very, very few responses, which I'm going to discuss a little later. But based on the responses of our networks and members, there are three emerging themes that I got. Number one is that disasters do not discriminate, but their effects amplify pre-existing inequalities. I'll elaborate on this later on. And then second, leadership and active citizenship of LGBTIQ activists, particularly in responding to disasters. And then number three, the criminalization and prevailing social stigma serves as a barrier to effective participation and in accessing services. So, yep. Next slide, please. Okay. All right. Yep. This is a photo I got from a friend of mine from Rizal who was badly affected last year during the storm. She's a freelance makeup artist. Her house was submerged. They live in an area which to some extent is from a low income community. She works freelance as a makeup artist, and all her paraphernalia to earn a living were damaged. Unfortunately, after the storm, there's not much support coming from the local government because beauty salons or working as a makeup artists are not deemed as one of the priorities of the local government in their disaster-related economic relief and aid. Now, I think it's important to recognize that, I think as also shared by our first speaker, the economic impact of climate change vis-a-vis disasters to LGBTIQ persons is very serious. A lot of LGBTIQ folks work in precarious environments. working as freelance makeup artists, sex workers. Because of discrimination, folks can hardly find long-term jobs with security of tenure. So I think it's one thing to emphasize how the climate change has a direct impact on the lived realities of LGBTIQ persons. But nonetheless, what we've noticed is that in situations of disasters, LGBTIQ persons take a leadership role. If you can show the next slide, please. Yep. So this is an interesting photo I got from Rojali, which is a trans-led organization in West Papua in Indonesia. We work with them in the context of activism leadership. I was so surprised when they shared with me that they have been conducting for the past few months a regular beach cleanups because they recognize that there's so much trash happening in their environment, and that the LGBT groups realize that we have to save the environment because it has a direct implication on our members. Their leader, Mama Lolita, shared with me a story of one of the trans women whom she's working with, who owns a beauty salon in an area that is near the river. She said that before, business was good, and then the river started to become stinky because of so much trash, and not much customers go to that particular beauty salon. And then she shared with me that we cannot allow this to happen because it's very difficult particularly for trans persons to find other spaces to set up their homes or their businesses, because not everybody's willing to lease a space for LGBTIQ persons in their community. So that, and in many other instances, prodded them to take environmental action seriously. Next slide, please. So another example is shared by Arco Iris from Timor-Leste. They've been doing awareness raising with regards humanitarian impact on LGBTIQ persons. So the organization, as a result of the recent cyclone last April, they've conducted humanitarian relief, particularly to more than 4,000 LGBTIQ persons who were displaced resulting from the flood. And they've also set up community kitchens so that their community members will have access to food. And then at the lower part, you have LGBT Bus, a local organization in Marikina City. So Reggie, who's a friend of mine, shared these photos to show that, hey, by the way, LGBTIQ persons are directly filling in the gaps where local government units and local organizations have failed to provide our communities. So they've done relief aid, etc., for the affected communities. Next slide, please. Okay, now earlier I mentioned that our work exists in a context of criminalization and social stigma. In Southeast Asia, we still have countries, several countries where there are criminal laws against consensual same-sex relations: Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, Myanmar. There are also laws that criminalize transgender persons, banning quote-unquote cross-dressing. A colleague of mine from Malaysia mentioned to me, Ryan, you know what? The issue of legal gender recognition is a gender issue, but I think it's also a climate change issue, because in their context, transgender women are excluded whenever government conducts rapid needs assessment during disaster situations, because they are excluded, they are not provided with relief aid and other needed responses. Another friend of mine said, what happens to particularly transgender and gender non-conforming persons who are casualties whenever there are disasters in our region, like in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia? People die because of flood. What happens to the dead bodies of LGBTIQ persons? Are they treated as male or female? Do their gender is their gender identity recognized whenever government and humanitarian organizations prepare statistics of casualties? So according to our colleagues, putting forward gender recognition is important so that before and during disasters, LGBTIQ persons are identified based on their preferred gender identity. And then there are also issues of harassment. I think our colleague earlier made mention of that. And there have been a lot of stories where trans women and gender non-conforming persons are harassed in gender segregated facilities such as bathrooms, in evacuation centers, even if they volunteer in the provision of relief goods in evacuation centers, they are also being catcalled or being blamed for being the source of a particular calamity or disaster. And then my last slide. Last slide, please. There. Back in 2018, we organized together with several other groups this regional meeting called Pride in the Humanitarian System. I think Roxanne, who's our speaker, is also was here in this conference, where we brought together LGBTIQ groups, humanitarian agencies, UN agencies, to really speak about where do LGBTIQ persons fare in the context of disasters. How do humanitarian organizations respond to our needs? And we did come up with several recommendations. You can read this report. It's uploaded online in the UN Women website. But let me emphasize the key points. Number one is that there's a need for a transformative approach in terms of working with LGBTIQ persons. It's always from the vulnerability approach. As such, the stories of resilience and leadership are often overshadowed. And then in that regard, it's very important for humanitarian agencies to engage with LGBTIQ communities in all aspects of disaster management. It's important that in the rapid needs assessment, their voices are being considered. It's important that evidence-based on the realities of LGBTIQ persons are gathered in a safe and secured manner. Second point is that there's a need for a SOGIE and feminist lens in all humanitarian work. One of the critique that was raised during this meeting is that gender and disaster or gender in humanitarian response tend to perpetuate the gender binary, man and woman. Oftentimes, LGBTIQ persons are, invisibilized in this kind of thinking. And humanitarian agencies should not only rely on experts or technical persons or advisors in their decision making. Consultation with LGBTIQ communities matter. Another point that was shared in this meeting is that the needs of persons affected by the disasters are similar, yet there are so much uniqueness as in a way that one size responses doesn't fit all. So intersectionality within the LGBTIQ community must also be recognized. One story that was shared to me, but this is more in the context of a COVID response. In Indonesia, local government offices would require persons to show their national IDs whenever they would be given the relief packages or cash aids or the ayuda. But according to trans folks there, showing their national ID is dangerous. For one, it reflects their gender assigned at birth and the name assigned at birth, which they reject. Second, by showing that ID, it opens doors for further harassment. And then number three, they might be questioned further and just to prove who they are in relation to what is shown in their ID. So for them, showing the ID itself is a barrier to access to support. And then also, the repeated issue of household vis-a-vis family as the basis of distribution of relief goods. In many contexts, non-heterosexual family or household arrangements are not yet recognized. So say, for example, single person household or same-sex couple household, these are not yet recognized. So as such, they are excluded again in the disaster response. And then lastly, we want to be protected and there's a need to work to prevent all types of violence. So folks tend to overlook that violence happens in the context of disasters. Prolonged quarantine periods in hostile family environments is an issue for many LGBTIQ persons. Isolation from the community is also perceived as a concern. So these are some of the human rights issues that LGBTIQ persons confront in the context of disasters. If I can summarize it, number one, consultation matters. Number two, leadership of LGBTIQ persons do matter. And then number three, it's important to recognize that the pre-existing discrimination, violence, and social stigma can pose as a barrier for LGBTIQ persons in receiving adequate support in the context of disasters. So, yep, thanks so much.
Yes, Ryan. Maraming salamat sa mga ibinahagi mo sa amin, and thank you for all the work that you do to promote and protect human rights for all people in ASEAN, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Napaka-importante ng mga initiatives na ginagawa nyo, and particularly it was really great to hear about the work that the organizations within your network are doing. So mapunta naman tayo ngayon sa mga challenges na kinakaharap ng mas nakababatang mga kapatid natin na LGBTQIA+ people. So may mga pagkakaiba ba yung vulnerabilities ng children, at paano ba natin maikayat ang mga kabataang LGBTQIA+ para makilahok sa climate action? And ano ba yung mga pwede nilang gawin? So let's call on Mickey to share his thoughts on this. Mickey, are you there? So what do you think?
Yep, hi Ferth. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And I'll start with a bit of story or background too, because this is very personal for a lot of people, probably for a lot of people who are listening and watching right now, and probably speaking to a lot of young LGBT people in the Philippines. So let me share my story on our next slide. So for me, next slide. So for me, I grew up in a part of the Philippines that's very much affected by the climate crisis. So this is my hometown basically. I grew up in LA, in Legazpi, Albay, where kami yung sumasalubong sa lahat ng typhoons, but also flooding, lahar, or ash flow from the Mayon volcano, but also, of course, volcanic eruptions and ashfall and tsunami, lahat na ng disasters halos. That was my entire life, basically in my entire youth. Next slide. As you can see in this map, the Philippines is already one of the most impacted by the climate crisis, along with a few other countries, but especially in the region, in the Bicol region. Next slide. So in 2006 was a pivotal time for me as a young second year high school. Yes, medyo matanda na ako. But I was second year high school back then in Legazpi, and this was the first time I encountered what's called a super typhoon. Super Typhoon Durian, or Riming, was the first time we experienced flash floods, and we really feared for our lives and the lives of our loved ones in our community. This was also the same year Al Gore's documentary film, An Inconvenient Truth, came out. So back in high school, 3 months, no electricity. A lot of times there's no water because of the super typhoon. But we were able to reflect on it because of the documentary. And I wrote a reflection paper about that. I really remember that distinctly. And I was like, okay, this is the biggest problem that we're facing, that my community in Bicol is facing. I need to dedicate my life and commit my life and education to this issue. Okay, so next slide. Fast forward to 10 years later, I was able to finally meet Al Gore because of the Climate Reality Project when we had our 2016 Manila training here in Manila with Al Gore and everyone else, and probably others who are also climate reality leaders. And between those years and even until now, next slide, I've been studying, the climate crisis, did a bachelor's degree in geography in UP, a master's degree in urban planning, studying low carbon development in Pasig City, and to really study about what kinds of actions can we take as a society, as urban planners, geographers, activists, to solve this crisis. Next slide. And I've also worked with organizations, for example, in Climate Action Network, a network of over 1,500 organizations, including Climate Reality, WWF, Greenpeace, Oxfam, and a few others here in the ASEAN region as well. But I've also volunteered as a junior board member of the Philippine LGBT Chamber of Commerce, and a few other organizations where we've been working with grassroots organizations and communities in the region and across the globe to find solutions to the climate crisis. Particularly during the UNFCCC COPs, that's where CAN is very much active because we sit as a civil society representative with other parties or governments. Next slide. And I've done this through my life, but not without challenges. I myself, I would still consider myself youth, based on UN definition of youth, which is under 30 or under 35. A young LGBT person growing up in this part of the world, in this part of the country, we face a lot of systemic challenges as an individual in our experiences. Firstly, social. We face social discrimination. We are traditionally marginalized in society. We face stigma for being LGBT, for being gay, lesbian, bakla, tomboy, etc. All these names have a negative connotation, and therefore that stigma, the stigma of HIV. Stereotypes, we are stereotyped as bakla, parlorista, whatever, comedian, all these stereotypes that don't really fit who we are as individuals and in our identities. We are also fetishized, especially with our race. As an Asian, gay, male person, I have been fetishized, especially when I lived abroad in the UK. And that's kind of like even before you got to know the person, there's already like some preconceived notion of what you do and who you are. And of course, we face a lot of social discrimination in terms of how we dress, what we're allowed to wear at work, in casual settings, informal and informal settings, also political. We have, like mentioned earlier by my fellow speakers, we have limited access to power and influence. Do LGBT people really get a seat at the table, or do people not come out to get that seat at the table? We know that obviously in the world, traditionally powerful people are these old white men, right? These old white men in the Western countries who have centered their power and influence with their institutions. We also face a lot of institutional discrimination. Institutions like marriage, education, work, labor rights. A lot of LGBT people, especially young people, are not able to access these rights, which some people would say are privileges, but these are rights as human beings. Regardless of your age, sex, or gender, or SOGIE, we are supposed to be afforded these rights. Of course, access to healthcare and medicine is a big one. Of course, in the LGBT community, a lot of us are not able to access these healthcare and services because, for example, for trans people, their medical certificates would be their sex assigned at birth. That would give them a different kind of healthcare services. HIV awareness, HIV treatment, that's also very limited still up to this day. It's not provided freely by for a lot of people, especially young people, wherein HIV and AIDS is very prevalent because there is lack of sex education, lack of institutional support, especially for younger people. And in terms of economic, as young people and LGBT people, we have lower purchasing power because of the limited economic opportunities that we have, being discriminated against for in the workplace. For example, the Jollibee case noon, she was denied the job opportunity for being a trans woman. And this is where the pink dollar, the pink peso in our case, comes in. And the Philippine LGBT Chamber of Commerce, we push for the value of the pink peso. That yes, we are a market, but we should not you should not do LGBT baiting as well, gay baiting, like sa mga ads, sa marketing. But we are pushing that we are valuable members and productive members of society. We should not be overshadowed. And also we push for equal rights in terms of workplace discrimination and hiring and all these economic opportunities. Despite all of these challenges that we face as young LGBTQ people, there are a lot of things that we can do. Next slide, please. But we have seen during this climate crisis, but also during the COVID-19 pandemic, that in this twin crises, it has shown that we live in a very unequal social system where the disadvantaged are disproportionately affected. Even the IPCC has come out with a report that LGBTQ people and non-binary people are much more affected by the climate crisis due to gender roles, gender expectations, limited economic opportunities, as pointed out earlier. And in both the COVID pandemic and the climate crisis, we have seen that we have to listen to the experts. We have to listen to the science. We have to face the reality, like we advocate in climate reality, and that urgent action is needed to save lives, to fight for our rights, and to ensure that both in the pandemic and the climate crisis, we are able to help those who are traditionally marginalized by society. Next slide. So what can we do about all of these problems? A lot of issues, but we want to focus on some of the solutions as well. Firstly, involvement in climate action. The youth are in particular leading the way. We have seen Greta Thunberg speak up. A lot of people, Mitzi from Fridays for Future, from Yakap here in the Philippines. A lot of young people stepping up to the challenge. And in a recent survey done worldwide, for Gen Z, the climate crisis or climate change is seen as the top or the biggest issue that we currently face today. Second is sustainable growth. We have to decouple carbon from economic growth. Traditionally, in the past several decades, our economic growth has been very much based on fossil fuels. Now we have to decouple our growth from fossil fuels and transition to a future based on renewable energy, to solar, to wind, to geothermal energy, for example, and hydro. And we have to live certain lives that is veering away from high carbon intensive foods, transportation, housing, etc. And lastly, let's support the movement. The climate movement is not just about about being an activist like Greta Thunberg, speaking to the media, etc. We can be very active on social media, join the mobilizations like we do at Pride. We should amplify these calls for climate justice. We in our own communities, wherever you are in the Philippines, you can organize, mobilize, and campaign to your leaders at home to push for anti-discrimination policies at the LGU level if we don't have it at the national level yet, like we do in Quezon City, for example, and Manila and Pasig, I think. And let's call on our leaders to provide these policies that would protect us as LGBTQ people from discrimination, but also from the climate crisis. Next slide, please. Because a lot of these changes can be done at the individual level as well. Let's start with sustainable consumption, low carbon products, and home gardening, and all these nice things we have started doing because of the pandemic. Green transport as well. We can work from home. We should promote walking, cycling, and the use of electric vehicles. And also in terms of food, we don't have to go vegan all of a sudden. If it's difficult for us culturally or economically, it is a bit expensive, but we can do less or no meat. Try to eat more whole foods, more plant-based diet, do a bit of urban farming and gardening, because if your food is locally sourced or sourced even at home, then that would reduce the carbon emissions as well. Next slide, please. Because as we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have shut our world. Our economies were shut down, factories were shut down, a lot of people were laid off from work, were jobless in different industries across the world, especially for poor communities. We have suffered a lot from the pandemic, but now we are starting to recover from it with the vaccine, with the changes in policies, with opening up of cities. As Naomi Klein, an author of The Shock Doctrine and our board member at 350.org said, we should not go back to normal because normal was already a crisis. And that's where building back better comes in. We should promote cycling nowadays, like we are seeing in Manila. We have to make these changes more permanent because we cannot go back to how it used to be because that was already a crisis. Next slide, please. And these are just some of the things we are seeing, some of the trends in the future with globalization, challenging global supply chains, e-commerce. Do you really have to go and travel so much to get the needs that you have at home? Location independent work or remote work like I do and a lot of people do in our community. A big focus on self-improvement and mental health, and make sure that during this pandemic, like they were saying, the next wave is going to be a mental health problem. And like a lot of us who are facing a lot of mental health issues, especially within the LGBTQIA plus community, we should be there for each other and also seek professional help when you need it. Um, a growth in the health and insurance market, making sure that we are healthy. That's also included with sustainable living and promotion of the social good. And that's the kind of lifestyle we want to achieve. Next slide, please. So what does the future look like? So these are some of the concepts that I want to introduce to you. And so that we can center our growth and our policies around these three things. Number one is green growth. Like I mentioned earlier, our growth and development can be sustainable, especially if it's based out of, it's not based on fossil fuels anymore. Lower carbon footprint, healthier consumption, cycling, electric or mass transit. Second is the sharing economy. We can now question if we have to really own things, because things always end up in landfills, right? Reducing our waste at home, sharing of vehicles through carpooling, for example, sharing of homes, etc. And this is something that is growing worldwide. And lastly, the circular economy. Goods can be designed in a circular way, because currently it's linear, right? Like there's production, there's consumption, and then they end up in landfills or in waste. We can make that circular so that things are not just recycled, but upcycled and repurposed for reuse by society. Next one, please. And now that we have seen the impact of the COVID pandemic and the climate crisis, this twin crisis, we are challenging ourselves to come up with a new social model, like we have when we created the United Nations, the G20, because of shocks and crises in the past and history. Now we have to come up with a new social order that's more equitable, wherein rich countries have to pay for the people's vaccine, for example, where in richer countries who have polluted and emitted such carbon emissions worldwide, impacting the most vulnerable who have least caused the climate crisis, are more responsible by financing $100 billion in climate finance per year and paying for loss and damage. Next slide, please. And as young people and LGBT people, together we can fight for climate and gender justice and continue living and calling for policies towards sustainable development and social equity for a greener and fair future for all. And in the last slide, I'd like to do a quick icebreaker. I want you to close your eyes or bow your eyes. Imagine a world where the pandemic is already over, a world wherein people have been vaccinated, a world that's safer, that's greener, that's less polluted, the air is cleaner. Imagine that world for 1 minute. And now let's open our eyes. And this is the time that we have to start working for this kind of future, for the world we want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mickey from LA, Legazpi Albay,
Thank you, Joe.
for explaining very well yung critical role of the young LGBTQA in advancing the climate change movement and for that imagination. So, kasi across the global climate space, we are already seeing young LGBTQIA climate justice advocates making significant strides for climate justice. Dito sa Pilipinas, syempre meron din. And taking off from what Mickey said, di ba yung, he said something like, we can't bounce back. We can only bounce forward. And moving forward, we need more voices to demand accountability from the country's decision makers on climate action and disaster risk reduction and management as well. Right, Ferth?
Yes, Jel, tama ka dyan. Kaya nga din natin binuo yung episode nito. Gusto natin mas empower pa ang LGBTQIA+ community to claim their space in the climate movement. So our discussions with our guests today have been very eye-opening and very informative, and we will have more of that later. So, but before we proceed, narito muna ang ilang mga paalala. In celebration of the Philippine Environment Month, the youth cluster of the Climate Reality Project Philippines, together with Wayfarers, invite the Filipino youth to niche My Place in the Climate Space. This is a 2-day online event that highlights the multidisciplinary nature of the climate crisis and how to address its impacts in a collaborative manner. This event aims to help young Filipinos explore the different niches in the climate and environmental movement that they could occupy if they want to be a part of it. The Experts Forum on June 26 will allow participants to learn the role of agriculture, waste, industry, transport, and energy sector in climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts from the country's sectoral experts. The Youth Forum on July 2, on the other hand, will provide a platform for young Filipinos to listen to the stories, lessons, and experiences of young climate and environmental advocates as they share their climate journeys. To participate in both events, mag-register lamang po sa link na naka-flash ngayon sa inyong screen.
Yes, sa mga kabataang nanonood sa atin ngayon, mag-register na kayo. Ito namang aking paalala ay para sa lahat. We invite everyone to be part of #Generation Restoration. Help us restore the earth this Philippine Environment Month by supporting Restore, an Adopt a Seedling donation drive. This donation drive will benefit the reforestation and forest conservation efforts of local community-based organizations in the Philippines and Indonesia. All funds raised will be used for tree planting activities scheduled on World Arbor Day, June 25th, in partnership with Feed Philippines and Alam Sehat Pestari for Indonesia. Maari po kayo mag-donate via GCash. Pumunta lamang sa Facebook page ng The Climate Reality Project Philippines para sa step-by-step instruction. Ang donation drive po na ito ay hanggang June 25 lamang. Kaya, donate na!
Yes, Jel. So please donate to our Adopt a Seedling drive. So hindi naman po kailangan malaki yung donasyon. Any amount would really help. And we would like to let our audience winners then from last week's episode na ipapadala na po namin ang inyong mga prizes in the coming week. So maaari lamang pakiabangan ang delivery ng manggagaling sa Climate Reality Project Philippines. Maraming salamat po sa inyong patience and understanding. So for this week po, magkakaroon po ulit tayo ng prizes para sa ating mga viewers. So pakasigutan lamang po yung tanong na nakalagay sa aming chat box sa Facebook page ng Climate Reality Project Philippines. Gusto po namin malaman how you are supporting the rights of LGBTQIA+ people. So paki-comment po ang inyong mga sagot at mamimili po kami ng 10 audience members na magbibigay ng makakahulugang kasagutan. Lastly, attention to our climate reality leaders. So we would like to remind you to sign up to the cluster you want to support based on your initiatives, advocacy, and or expertise. So far, we have yet to activate yung human security cluster, food security cluster, transport subcluster, and water sufficiency cluster. So please refer to the activation of cluster email from the branch for the registration links to these clusters. Abangan din po natin ang mga announcement mula sa branch kung kailan magaganap ang strategic planning sessions ng bawat cluster. And before tayo mag-move on sa susunod po natin na guest, meron pong katanungan na iniraise mula sa ating chat box mula kay Cleo Mosquela. So ang sabi niya, parang mensahe niya to sa ating mga speakers. Thank you so much for the speakers and the knowledge shared. I do research on minoritized population in the US in the context of climate change, and I understand the importance of unearthing the vulnerabilities the marginalized communities experience, and this is especially useful in the context of protecting human rights. I was wondering whether the speakers could also highlight examples of ingenuity of the LGBTQIA+ community and facing disasters or climate change or despite the vulnerabilities or invisibilization processes they experience. And napaka-tumpak po nung question na to, no? Dahil yung susunod po natin na mga speakers ay tatalakayin itong mga ganitong types of initiative. Tama ba ako, Jel?
Yes, thank you, Ferth. So, let's now proceed to the second part of our discussion with our resource speakers. And in this segment, we'll focus on the stories and initiatives of the LGBTQIA organizations in climate action. We will now discuss how we will ensure that national and local discussions and policy decisions will include the perspective of LGBTQIA of the LGBTQIA community. Maybe we can start with Mikko. Mikko, can you please share with us the work of MapBeks? What motivated you to start this initiative? And how is this organization promoting LGBTQIA participation in climate adaptation and disasters reduction efforts?
Sige. Hindi ko kinaya yung invisibilization kanina. Pero I'll do my best to share our efforts from MapBeks. So I'll just share my screen. Wait. Kita po ba yung slide? Yeah. So, hello, good afternoon. So, again, I'm Mikko. So, I'm one of the founders of MapBeks. And yung kwento ni MapBeks is very much linked to the story of my work life even before establishing MapBeks. So to introduce, so si MapBeks is an online community of volunteers advocating for LGBT representation and inclusion in various mapping platforms, specifically OpenStreetMap. So ang kwento nga ni MapBeks ay it started at yung formally it launched in 2020, January 2020. So ang laking dagok din nung pandemic para ma-launch din yung mga projects that MapBeks really wanted to push. So ginagamit ni MapBeks ang core ng mapping or yung pagmamapa ng mga spaces and places at tinalagay nito yung mapa as a form of representation para i-assert yung evidence at yung actuality that it really exists in the world. So even before yung World War II, ginagamit na talaga yung mga mapa upang lituhin yung mga kalaban, upang ipaalam kung nasaan yung mga lugar. And currently din sa ating sistema sa Philippines, in the planning process, in the way we make laws, in the way we make decisions, maps are a very helpful tool for us to come up with better policies, to come up with better decisions para maibigay natin yung mga programa nating gustong ibigay. So aside from establishing MapBeks, I also helped establish a subculture LGBT organizations specifically for bears, jobs, and yung admirers nito. And we were holding events lagi before mga 2018, 2019. And doon ko nakita that there were a lot of LGBT organizations in the Philippines. Ang daming groups, ang daming communities, ang daming initiatives, ang daming advocacies, ganyan. And napansin ko na parang nagiging events, puro events ganyan ang nangyayari. And parang nagiging secondary na lang yung pagtulong, yung mga pag-push ng advocacies. So parang nakita ko sa MapBeks, I invited my group before in one of what we call in the mapping community, a mapping party or a mapathon. And we tried experiencing kung magagawa ba yung pagmamapa o yung pagdodrawing ng mga buildings, roads in various areas, lalo na yung mga remote communities na posibleng tamaan ng bagyo or ng mga super typhoons. So ayun, naging maganda naman yung experience, especially with working with the Red Cross. Parang ka-align na lang yung mga profession ko. And in 2020, I was able to talk with Andy, the founder of a mapping community called Mental Health Awareness. Ang specialization naman nila is mental health advocacy. So parang naisip namin sa MapBeks na why not let's do an advocacy na focusing on tapping that very rich, very diverse, very wide network ng LGBT. So makikita niyo sa pictures na yun, ang dami rin naming events na gawa even before the pandemic struck in 2020 and shifting our programs then to online. So recently, currently MapBeks has a total of 13 core volunteers, pero all over the Philippines it has a network, especially with individual volunteers na tumutulong sa pagmamapa ng various places. Okay. So among the projects ng MapBeks, I'll just share some. Si HIV facilities and support mapping. So MapBeks actually supports and map out yung mga facilities na to that cater to the PLHIV community or people living with HIV and directing them kung saan yung mga near facilities to them. So kanina nga nabanggit na yung mga access to health, access to support ay talagang kulang lalo na sa LGBT community, mas lalo pang kulang lalo na sa mga PLHIV community. So itong maps na ganito, it became very useful, especially during the pandemic when DOH actually when transport systems were cut off and DOH basically ordered na you could get your life-saving medicine sa nearest treatment hubs nyo. People only knew them in tables, in Excel files, ganyan, and in directories, pero no actual map was actually showing kung which ones were nearest to you. And real time, nagawa din ni MapBeks in partnership with the Red Whistle and UP Babaylan and various HIV advocacy groups na maging real time yung pag-update ng information and malaman kung alin yung bukas, ano yung sarado, and conduct analysis din dun sa map data na napo-provide o nakukuha dun from yung ganong efforts. So ito yung map, you'll be able to see which ones are the closest HIV testing centers, primary health clinics, treatment sites, psychosocial support, legal support, and housing support for PLHIV. Ayan. So this was crowdsourced from various sources. Tapos yung mga members ang nagtutulong-tulungan para mahanap siya and put it on the map. Aside from that, we also conduct, we have an LGBT safe spaces map. So talagang there is a lack of safe spaces all over the Philippines. Normally, there are a lot of LGBT organizations and communities, especially sa buong Pilipinas. And kanina rin nabanggit ng ating first speaker that there are only select towns, cities, and barangays that are protected by anti-discrimination ordinances. So this project, the LGBT Safe Spaces Project, aims to promote yung safe spaces na to and provide solution dun sa malaking gap na marami pang lugar sa Philippines ang walang protection for the LGBT community. So we try to map and have memorandum of agreements with these businesses, organizations, companies that can assure that the LGBT community in their premises are protected from any form of discrimination. So kumbaga, it's a form of memorandum of agreement. So if in case any form of ayun nga, nung nangyari, somehow we have documents and forms of protection para ma-push to. So ayun, minamap talaga yung mga organizations so that it also can provide a social network. If ever there's a disaster, you'll be able to know or identify yung nearest LGBT organizations and support groups that it can provide support. So ito medyo challenging lang kasi a lot of organizations are still very wary of and cautious of putting their location dun sa kanilang sa map. Pero we would like to really promote it na the more that the people can see that we are visible on the map, the more that they can, mas madali kasing ma-absorb ng tao na ay ang dami talaga nila, ang dami palang groups, ang daming forces that combine through the LGBT movement and nakakapag-sway din to ng decisions ng mga policy makers. So I think yung biggest project namin right now for 2021 would be yung AMNAT Philippines. Its effort is to really map out the most remote towns and communities in the Philippines. So this at the left side, you have a map of yung mga places na wala masyadong data on map data, especially on buildings. So yung buildings, nagsisignify siya usually ng location ng family. So itong orange parts ay mga places na wala masyadong data on those location ng buildings or / families on OpenStreetMap. So si MapBeks in 2020 targeted the most unmapped 25 towns in the Philippines. So na-map niya totally yan in 2020. So ayan, mostly are in Mindanao and Visayas. Pero ayun. So for 2021, ito pala yung some outputs from 2020. So through the mapping ng mga buildings and roads, we were able to provide support then for some municipalities in Mindanao, in Maguindanao, specifically Paglat, Bangudadatu. We have support in Ferrol, in Romblon, and other towns that were able to get the data since it's open source and it's in OpenStreetMap. We also tapped out other advocacies such as ito yung Bikes for Bex, so that we could promote yung mapping. At the same time, aside from mapping, we are able to also provide direct support to transport with the lockdowns. So yung nagawa namin, we were able to raise more than 30,000 pesos through donations and mapping. And we were able to provide 3 bikes to HIV and AIDS support house para itong bikes, they could provide it to their frontliners, pwede nilang gamitin for HIV screening, consultation, and delivery of medicine. So 2021, we also did something like this, the donation and mapping drive. Pero it's a para kay Kuya movement naman, which is yung mga map buildings and donations goes to ikot and toki drivers affected nung pandemic sa UP Diliman. Ayan, so ito yung current project namin with in 2021, we're actually mapping the whole of Tarlac. So we're tapping LGBT organizations, advocates, individuals, allies actually, to help us map etong town na to. So in return, si PLGU, yung provincial local government ni Tarlac, agrees on, so pag binap namin to, they agree on actually conducting, na pumapayag din sila na mag-SOGIE 101 with their staff, ganyan. So parang nag-ex deal si MapBeks to do the mapping in return na, okay, let's do SOGIE SC para mas magkaroon tayo ng mas maraming allies doon sa mga policy makers and the like. So just to add, in the planning process then, governments are local government units are required to submit comprehensive land use plan, and yung data actually nito are very much contributing to the climate and disaster risk assessment dun sa plan na yon. So kaya very maganda yung position ng MapBeks in order to really encourage more people to see the LGBT community at maging star talaga yung LGBT community, lalo na sa mas malaking realm ng pagmamapa sa buong mundo. So I guess more information could be seen sa website namin. We have mapbeks.org. You could also reach us sa Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So if you'd like to know more about how we do the mapping or join us in one of our mapping parties para ma-experience nyo and really help provide that data, you can just reach out to us. So we still have events going on in the next couple of months. Ayun lang. I'd like to leave a note na lang na ito, since yung world talaga ng mapping is dominated by male, cisgendered male, gusto ko lang talaga i-leave na not all spaces are mapped by straight lines. So talagang we're really asserting our visibility sa mapping community. Ayun na lang, and thank you very much. Ano?
Yeah. Alright. Thank you so much, Mikko. Sobrang ganda nung last message mo, no? At salamat din sa mga bumubuo ng MapBeks. Alam nyo, what diversity, inclusion, and representation yung ating visibility ng ating komunidad. So, mapunta naman tayo kay Roxanne at sa Bisdak Pride. Roxanne, can you share with us ano ba yung mga activities and initiatives of Bisdak Pride on climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction? So maaari mo rin bang i-share kung ano yung mga nakita mong pagsubok na kinakaharap ng mga membro ng Bisdak Pride when it comes to climate change and disasters? And bukod diyan, can you also answer this question? So how can we increase and ensure the active participation of gender and sexual minorities in adaptation and resilience building efforts? Roxanne?
Yes po, thank you. I'll prepare my slide. Okay, so this is my presentation. Yes, for the past, in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan, we conducted several activities that focus on inclusion. So ito yung conference about listening to understanding the unheard LGBT voices in the Yolanda affected communities in the Visayas. So partnership with local government units, then an international aid organization based in the United States and our organization. So ito yung highlights ng first conference namin. The objective was to generate views and finding out the economic, social, and political Typhoon Haiyan before, during, and after, and position LGBT communities in the Visayas on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction management, and create LGBT advocates. So one thing na nangyari dito is that yung mga bi women, lesbians during our workshop, they did not share the results of their workshop, which we respected naman. Sa lahat ng mga participants, sila rin yung hindi nag-share. Then on the other hand, aside from conference, meron din kaming forum theater, no, on adolescent reproductive health and rights, informed choice and teenage pregnancy. So this is in partnership with Panghalang Pilipino as well as UNICEF in the Philippines. So we perform in an open area kasi forum theater siya, then the audience are captured and may specific na requirements din. On the other hand, meron din kaming building resilient LGBT communities in the Visayas. So we also tackle about as part of the as part of the conference, may resolution kami noon na I think there is a need to organize LGBT communities in the Visayas. So we conducted this organizing activity. Kasi and then during this period, prominent din yung mga extrajudicial killings, which also includes LGBT members. So nag-ano din kami. We also register our opposition to AJK during this time. And we also have a project with Edge Effect based in Australia, which aims to strengthen institutional capacities and networking towards sustainability while operating under the context of the situation of LGBTQIA plus rights in the Visayas. We hope to share to you sa climate change project ang results ng aming research sa lahat ng mga partners namin ngayon para magamit din yung as reference. Then to summarize, ito yung mga nagawa namin in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan, itong apat. Then meron din kami COVID-19 related activities. Hindi ko nasari dito yung voice theater kasi we cannot perform physically in communities. So ang ginawa namin, nag-innovate kami, nag-voice theater kami, tapos yung trompa, yung para siyang sasakyan ng malaking sound system, magpe-play sa communities na target namin. Yes, so ito yung sinabi din ni Ryan earlier na I was part of fortunately I was part of the first part of the humanitarian system. I was invited by ASEAN SOGIE Caucus to provide or to deliver also our experiences on matters related to inclusion, mga persons with diverse SOGIE related sa CCA and BRRM. And this is also different kasi this picture I was part of the Asia Pacific Alliance for Disaster Management, in which we also link with various micro, small, and medium entrepreneurs in the Philippines. So I think ito lang. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. Grabe. Thank you for sharing very impressive and innovative initiatives. Talagang grabe. Hindi talaga naubusan ng nakakamahang grassroots. Oo. Dito sa Pilipinas na nagsusulong ng gender equality and LGBTQIA rights. So, we have Bisdak Pride, MapBeks, at syempre yung ASEAN Caucus. And these are just some of the organizations we must support when it comes to pushing for representation, equality, and inclusion. Pero ito mga pinaglalaban natin to ay hindi dapat huminto sa grassroots community. This must be institutionalized. Right, Ferth?
Nako, tumpak na tumpak ka talaga dyan, Jel. So kaya naman bilang para tapusin itong segment, samantalahin natin itong pagkakataon na ito, no? So kami po ay nananawagan sa Kongreso, tama na ang 21 taon na pagkitil sa pagsasabatas ng SOGIE Bill. So panahon na po para ipasa ito. So yung passage ng SOGIE Equality Bill would really enable us to plan for a rights-based and evidence-based response to climate-related disasters. And even the pandemic and other human rights violations. So kami rin po ay nananawagan sa ating mga kasama sa climate change movement, let us please broaden the scope of our climate activism to include social injustice issues such as LGBTQIA+ rights. So doing so would really ensure that we are pushing for a genuinely transitional climate justice.
Here, here. Alam mo, Ferth, sobrang nakaka-uplift yung mga yung mga pagkakataong ganito. Sana mas marami pang ganitong platform and opportunity para mapag-usapan natin yung intersectionality ng mga significant movements na sinusulong natin. Talagang we can learn a lot from each other. Kaya naman dito sa next segment natin, isang tanong lang ang ipapasagot natin sa ating mga resource speakers. And to shake things up, balita ko, gagamit tayo ng ibang platform today.
Yes, Jill. So today, medyo may konting pauso tayo. So we will be asking our resource speakers to go to www.menti.com. So kanina naturuan na natin sila kung paano gawin ito and kung paano na i-input yung answers na dito. So ayan, nakikita ngayon ng speakers natin sa screen when you go to www.menti.com. You can use the code na makikita nyo ngayon sa screen. So 40232791. Ayan. So, habang naghihintay tayo sa ating mga speakers, nais po natin siyempre pasalamatan ulit yung ating mga partners, yung ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, ang Metro Manila Pride, ang MapBeks at ang Mindanao Pride at ang Bisdak Pride. Ayan. So, nagsimula na silang magbigay ng mga words, Jel. Ano ba yung mga nakita natin, Jel?
And tenacity, consistency, zeal. Wow.
Ayan.
Big
Dami,
words.
No? So, ayan. So, kung meron pang mga magsabit ng answers, ayan, meron pang mga dumadagdag.
Yan, fierce, fun, fabulous. Innovation.
Ayan. Thank you po sa mga nag-respond sa ating mga speakers and truly, no, ang dami nating pwedeng matutunan talaga sa ating mula sa climate, ang daming pwedeng matutunan ng climate movement mula sa ating LGBTQIA+ movement. So ayan, meron pang mga dumagdag, sustainable movement and determination and commitment.
Solidarity, transformative. Yes.
Yes, tumpak na tumpak po yung inyong mga kasagutan.
Yes. So, gusto po namin magpasalamat sa ating guest speakers today, kay Rachel, Roxanne, Mickey, Mikko, and Ryan. Thank you so much for lending your time and your voice to us. Grabe yung discussions ngayon were so full of heart and passion. You all have made our Saturday afternoon really meaningful. And we would also like to thank all our climate reality leaders and other sustainability advocates who tuned into our Facebook page to watch this episode. Again, if you would like to receive a certificate from us, please type in your name and accomplish the Google form na ililink namin sa comment section.
Ayan. So, happy Pride Month sa lahat. So, marami po tayong dapat gawin to ensure a more equitable and resilient Philippines. But our discussions today really gave me hope. So, kaya nga, thank you to our speakers for inspiring us today. So to close, we would like to remind everyone, please visit the Instagram page of the Climate Reality Project Philippines at Climate Reality PH and our Twitter account at Climate Real PH. And then you may also visit and follow the socials of our guest organizations. So their handles are flash on screen. So we have the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, MapBeks, Mindanao Pride, Bisdak Pride, Metro Manila Pride, and the Climate Action Network International. So this has been Klimatotohanan, a fortnightly webcast organized and led by our climate reality leaders to tackle urgent climate issues of today and tomorrow. Why Klimatotohanan? Because we need real talk and real action on the climate crisis. Thank you once again for tuning in and see you again in our next episode. Mabuhay kayo!